So there I was, sitting in the most prestigious lecture hall in the known galaxy, watching aliens lose their collective minds over what was basically a fancy word problem. The Zephian Academy, if you haven't heard of it, is where the universe sends its brightest minds to feel intellectually superior to each other. Think Harvard, but with more tentacles and significantly worse cafeteria food. The human exchange program had landed me here for what Earth diplomatically called cultural enrichment. And what I suspected was really just, let's see if Marcus can avoid starting an interstellar incident for one semester. Spoiler alert, the jury was still out on that one. Today's entertainment was the annual Grand Intellectual Challenge, which sounds way more impressive than it actually was. Picture a bunch of aliens in what could generously be called academic robes, all puffing up their various appendages while trying to solve problems that would supposedly reshape our understanding of reality itself. The drama was thick enough to cut with a laser sword. To my left sat Vexstar, a crystalline being whose entire body looked like someone had crossbred a diamond with a very anxious mathematician. 4 arms constantly scribbled equations in the air, leaving glowing trails of numbers that hurt to look at directly. He'd been introduced as the finest mathematical mind of his generation, which apparently meant he could calculate pi to 1 trillion decimal places while simultaneously solving quantum field equation. Show off. Behind me, Professor Quillick was doing that thing where he pretended to read ancient texts, while actually just trying to look more intelligent than everyone else. Picture an octopus that had gone to one too many philosophy conferences, and you'd be close. His 17 tentacles held 17 different scholarly journals, because apparently regular beings only needed one brain to read with. His credentials included doctorates from 7 different star systems and a really irritating habit of using words that didn't exist in any known language. And then there was Nova 7, the cybernetic prodigy who looked like someone had taken a perfectly good robot and decided it needed more attitude. Her neural processors were supposedly capable of computing solutions faster than most civilizations could even understand the problems. She kept making little beeping sounds that I was pretty sure were the electronic equivalent of eye-rolling. The challenge itself was announced with all the pomp and circumstance you'd expect from a species that had nothing better to do than make everything unnecessarily dramatic. Professor Zenthak, who looked like a cross between a flamingo and a filing cabinet, cleared his throat with the sound of grinding metal and spoke. Today's challenge is the legendary paradox of infinite recursion, a problem that has confounded the greatest minds across 17 star systems for over 2 millennia. The being who solves this will be remembered throughout galactic history as a true intellectual pioneer. I was already reaching for my snack pack when he continued. The problem involves a recursive loop of causality wherein each solution generates its own contradiction, requiring simultaneous proof of impossibility and necessity across multiple dimensional frameworks. Right. So basically, it was one of those problems that sounded complicated because they used big words to describe what was probably something pretty straightforward. I'd seen this before in my advanced logic classes back on Earth, though admittedly the professor there had been less dramatic about it, and hadn't insisted on wearing ceremonial robes that looked like they'd been designed by someone who'd never actually seen fabric before. The best part? Everyone was looking at me with that mixture of pity and condescension that screamed, "Oh, look, the primitive human thinks he can play with the big kids. If they only knew what was coming." What happened next was basically a masterclass in how to overthink yourself into complete intellectual paralysis. I'm talking about the kind of mental gymnastics that would make an Olympic athlete weep with envy. Vexstar went first, naturally, because apparently when you're made of living crystal and have 4 arms, you get to show off before everyone else. He started by projecting holographic equations into the air that looked like someone had let a mathematician have a seizure in 3 dimensions. I'm not kidding, there were symbols floating around that hurt to look at directly, and numbers that seemed to exist in colors that didn't have names. "Observe," he announced in that tone that screamed, "I'm about to be very impressed with myself, as I apply the Corvathan matrix of dimensional causality to establish baseline parameters for recursive analysis." What followed was essentially watching someone try to solve a jigsaw puzzle by building their own table, carving their own puzzle pieces, and then writing a dissertation on why puzzles shouldn't exist in the first place. His crystalline body started glowing brighter and brighter as he worked through calculations that would have made Stephen Hawking reach for a calculator and a stiff drink. 20 minutes in, actual steam was rising from his crystal brain. Not metaphorical steam, mind you. Literal vapor was coming off this guy's head as his internal processors worked overtime. He was muttering things like transdimensional coefficient matrices and inverse probability cascades, while his forearms moved so fast they were basically a blur. Then he just stopped, froze completely. For a moment I thought he'd actually solved it, but no. He'd basically given himself the alien equivalent of a blue screen of death. His glow flickered, dimmed, and he slumped back in his chair, with what could only be described as electronic exhaustion. The mathematical complexities exceed computational capacity, he wheezed, which I'm pretty sure was fancy alien speak for "my brain just broke." Professor Quillix was up next, and oh boy, did he bring the academic drama. This guy treated the problem like it was his doctoral thesis, his tenure review, and his midlife crisis all rolled into one. He started sprouting additional tentacles, which apparently happened when he got really excited about being intellectually superior to everyone. Clearly, he began, adjusting what I can only assume were designer spectacles. This requires a multi-paradigmatic approach utilizing post-structural, deconstructionist methodology combined with neoclassical recursive theoretical frameworks. I had no idea what any of that meant, but it sounded expensive. He began pulling out texts that looked older than most civilizations, books that seemed to whisper in languages that predated the invention of vowels. His tentacles were flying across pages, cross-referencing theories that had probably been outdated before humans discovered fire. The guy was literally building philosophical arguments in real time, constructing logical frameworks that would have made Aristotle quit philosophy and take up basket weaving instead. He spent 30 minutes just defining his terms, another 20 establishing his theoretical foundation, and then dove into what he called the essential paradoxical nature of recursive impossibility within finite consciousness. By the end, he'd grown 3 more tentacles just to hold all the reference materials he'd decided were necessary. His final conclusion was basically a 1,000-word essay on why the problem might not actually have a solution, which seemed like a really elaborate way to say, "I give up." Nova 7's attempt was perhaps the most spectacular failure of all, mostly because she approached it like she was trying to brute force hack the universe itself. Her processors started whirring so loud it sounded like a jet engine having an argument with a blender. She began running through computational algorithms at speeds that would have made a supercomputer jealous. Numbers and data streams started projecting from her optical sensors, creating what looked like the most aggressive PowerPoint presentation in galactic history. She was processing millions of possible solutions per second, running probability calculations that would have crashed NASA's entire computer network. The really impressive part was watching her systematically eliminate every possible approach known to computational science. She tried quantum processing, parallel universe modeling, even something she called hyperdimensional logic mapping, which sounded like she'd made it up on the spot, but somehow made it work anyway. 25 minutes in, she was literally smoking. Not like, wow, she's really smart smoking, but actual smoke was coming out of her cooling vents. Her vocal processors started making sounds like a dying modem having an existential crisis. Finally, she just shut down. Complete system failure. Emergency cooling protocols kicked in and she slumped forward onto the desk with a sound like a computer tower being dropped down a flight of stairs. Meanwhile, I'd been working my way through what the Academy cafeteria had optimistically labeled nutritional sustenance units, but which tasted like someone had decided cardboard needed more fiber. The aliens kept glancing over at me, like they expected me to start panicking, or at least show some sign that I understood the magnitude of what I was witnessing. Instead, I was trying to figure out if the green stuff in my lunch was supposed to be edible, or if it was just some kind of alien garnish that had achieved sentience. The problem they were all losing their minds over was starting to look familiar, like something I'd seen before but couldn't quite place. That's when Professor Zenthek cleared his throat again and announced that it was the primitive human's turn to embarrass himself in front of galactic academia. Now, I want to be clear about something. I wasn't trying to show off. I wasn't trying to make a statement about human intellectual superiority or anything like that. I was honestly just hungry, slightly bored, and really wanted to get this over with so I could figure out if the Academy library had any books that didn't require a PhD in theoretical physics just to open. But apparently, confidence looks a lot like arrogance when you're the only human in a room full of aliens who think they've cornered the market on being smart. I stood up, walked over to the problem display, and took a good long look at what had just fried 3 of the galaxy's supposedly brightest minds. And that's when it clicked. I actually started laughing. Which probably wasn't the best diplomatic move, but honestly, I couldn't help it. "Oh, come on," I said, still chuckling. "Seriously? This is what you guys have been calling impossible for 2,000 years?" The silence that followed was the kind of quiet you usually only hear right before something explodes. Professor Zenthok's filing cabinet face somehow managed to look offended, which was impressive, given that he didn't actually have facial features. Perhaps the human would care to elaborate on his amusement, he said in that tone professors use when they're about to enjoy watching a student crash and burn. Right, okay. I turned back to the problem display. So you've got a recursive loop where each solution creates its own contradiction, and you need to prove both impossibility and necessity simultaneously across multiple dimensions. I grabbed what passed for a marker in this place, which was actually some kind of light projection device that probably cost more than my entire education, and started sketching on the holographic display. The thing is, you're all approaching this like it's a problem to be solved when it's actually a system to be understood. You're trying to find the answer, but the answer is that there isn't supposed to be one. That's not a bug. That's the feature. I drew a simple diagram that would have been familiar to any human who'd made it through high school geometry. Just basic loops and decision trees, nothing fancy. Look, the recursion isn't trying to solve itself. It's trying to demonstrate something. Each iteration doesn't create a contradiction, it reveals one that was already there in the premise. You're not supposed to resolve the paradox, you're supposed to recognize that the paradox is the resolution. Vextar's crystal body had stopped smoking and was now pulsing with what I assumed was confusion. But the mathematical impossibility isn't impossible, it's inevitable. That's the point. I added a few more lines to my diagram. The system is designed to show you that some questions don't have answers because the questions themselves are based on false assumptions. You're asking, how do we solve the unsolvable, when you should be asking, why are we assuming it needs to be solved? Nova 7's systems had apparently rebooted, because she started beeping in what sounded like electronic confusion. Processing, but the computational requirements, the dimensional frameworks, are completely unnecessary. I finished the diagram with a flourish. You're trying to build a rocket ship to cross the street. Sometimes the simplest answer is the right one, even when it doesn't feel impressive enough. Professor Quillix had grown 2 more tentacles, which I was starting to think was his species' equivalent of a nervous tick. But the theoretical implications, the centuries of academic discourse, the established paradigmatic methodology, are all based on the assumption that complexity equals intelligence. I stepped back from the display. Sometimes a problem that looks impossible is just badly explained. Sometimes what looks like advanced physics is just basic logic wearing fancy clothes. The solution was right there, spelled out in what any human would recognize as a basic flowchart. Nothing exotic, nothing that required supercomputers or crystalline brains or centuries of philosophical training. Just simple, straightforward pattern recognition and the willingness to question whether the question actually made sense in the first place. I'd essentially solved their impossible paradox by treating it like a logic puzzle from a children's activity book, the kind of thing you'd find in the Sunday newspaper right next to the crossword, with a difficulty rating of moderate and instructions that began with ages 8 and up. The really funny part was watching their faces, or what passed for faces in this crowd, as they realized that my solution actually worked. Not just theoretically, but practically, elegantly, and with a simplicity that made all their previous attempts look like they'd been trying to perform surgery with a sledgehammer. Professor Zenthic was making a sound like a filing cabinet being dragged across concrete, which I was pretty sure meant he was having some kind of academic crisis. This cannot be. The complexity requirements alone should have what? I asked, genuinely curious. Made it harder? Sometimes making things complicated just makes them complicated, not better. That's when I realized I should probably explain exactly why this had been so easy for me. That's when I dropped the line that apparently broke their entire understanding of human intellectual development. I mean, it's basically just a more complex version of problems we give to 12-year-olds back home. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of absolute, perfect silence that usually comes right before someone realizes their entire worldview has just been turned upside down and shaken until all the loose change fell out. "I'm sorry," Professor Quillix said, his voice coming out as a strangled whisper that somehow managed to sound dignified despite the fact that he was currently sprouting tentacles like a confused sea anemone. "Did you just say 12-year-olds? Well, maybe 13, for the really tricky ones," I said, because apparently I have zero sense of when to stop talking. "But yeah, this is basically what we call a logic puzzle. We use them to teach kids critical thinking skills. You know, pattern recognition, assumption questioning, recursive problem solving, the usual stuff." The look on their faces, or face-adjacent areas, was the kind of expression you see when someone realizes they've been using a Formula One racing car to deliver pizza. A mixture of confusion, horror, and the dawning realization that they might have fundamentally misunderstood something very important. Vextar's crystalline form was flickering like a broken fluorescent light. "You? Your species trains its offspring with paradoxes of this complexity? Oh, this isn't even that complex by our standards, I said, which in hindsight probably wasn't the most diplomatic response. I mean, sure, it looks fancy with all the dimensional framework stuff, but strip away the academic jargon and it's just a basic recursive loop with a false premise. We teach kids to spot those in middle school. Nova 7's processors were whirring again, but this time it sounded less like computation and more like electronic panic. Define middle school in your educational parameters. Ages 11 to 14, roughly. It's when we start teaching them how to think instead of just what to think. Logic puzzles, paradoxes, critical analysis, debate techniques, philosophical thought experiments. You know, the building blocks of rational thought. The silence stretched on for so long I started wondering if I'd accidentally broken them. Then Professor Quillix made a sound like someone slowly deflating a balloon filled with academic pretension. You train children with the intellectual tools that represent the pinnacle of our civilization's achievements? Well, when you put it like that, it sounds kind of intense, I admitted. But honestly, human kids are pretty brutal when it comes to logic. They haven't learned to be polite about pointing out when something doesn't make sense yet. Give a 10-year-old a philosophical paradox and they'll tear it apart in ways that would make Socrates cry. I was really getting warmed up now, which was probably a mistake, but nobody had stopped me yet. Like, we have this thing called the SAT, right? It's a standardized test that 17 and 18-year-olds take to get into college. One section is basically nothing but logic puzzles, pattern recognition, and reading comprehension designed to test critical thinking skills. The kind of stuff you guys just spent an hour failing at? That's literally Tuesday afternoon for a high school senior who's cramming for college entrance exams. Vexter's glow was now less brilliant crystalline intelligence and more fluorescent bulb about to die. Your adolescents are required to demonstrate mastery of advanced logical frameworks for educational advancement? Required? Oh no, it's way worse than that. It's competitive. We've got millions of teenagers every year trying to outperform each other on tests that include the same kind of recursive logical challenges you guys just called impossible, and they have to do it in timed conditions, under pressure, while also worrying about acne and whether their crush likes them back. Nova 7 started making a sound like a dial-up modem having an existential crisis. The psychological stress parameters alone should render such cognitive performance impossible. You'd think so, right? But that's kind of the point. We don't just teach kids to solve problems when everything's perfect and they have unlimited time and resources. We teach them to think clearly when everything's going wrong, when they're stressed, when they're tired, when they've got 17 other things to worry about. I was starting to realize that maybe I should tone this down a bit, but honestly, their reactions were kind of fascinating from an anthropological perspective. See, the thing about human education is that we don't really believe in making things easy. We call it trial by fire or sink or swim methodology. We throw kids into intellectual challenges that are just barely within their capability to handle, and then we make them figure it out on their own. Not because we're cruel, but because that's how you build real problem-solving skills. Professor Quillix had now grown so many tentacles that he looked like he was auditioning for a role as a very confused sea monster. But the development requirements, the cognitive infrastructure necessary to support such advanced analytical capabilities, starts around age 5 with basic logic games and pattern recognition exercises, I continued, because apparently I have no concept of when to stop explaining things. By age 8, they're doing word problems that require multiple steps of logical reasoning. By 10, they're analyzing literature for themes, subtext, and authorial intent. By 12, they're debugging their own logical arguments and identifying fallacies in other people's reasoning. And this is standard? Vextar asked in a voice that suggested he was questioning everything he'd ever believed about intelligence. This is the minimum baseline, I said. The kids who struggle with this stuff get extra help and tutoring until they can keep up. The kids who find it easy get thrown into advanced placement programs with even harder challenges. We've got 14-year-olds taking college-level courses in logic, philosophy, and theoretical mathematics. Nova 7's cooling fans kicked into overdrive. Your species weaponizes intellectual development. Weaponizes. That's actually not a terrible way to put it, I admitted. We figure that if you're going to survive in a universe full of complex problems, you better be really, really good at solving problems. So we spend the first 18 years of every human's life basically putting them through intellectual boot camp. The aliens were all staring at me now with what I was pretty sure was a mixture of horror and respect. Like they'd just realized that what they thought was a harmless house cat was actually a tiger that had been pretending to be domesticated. So, When you say this paradox is something you give to children, Professor Zenthok said slowly, like he was afraid of the answer, I'm saying that any human who made it through high school should be able to solve this in about 10 minutes, assuming they're not distracted by their phone or thinking about lunch, and most of them would probably complain that it's too easy and ask if there's a harder version. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the hum of the Academy's environmental systems. Somewhere in the distance, what sounded like academic careers were quietly imploding. What happened next was basically watching the intellectual equivalent of several civilizations having simultaneous nervous breakdowns. I'm talking about the kind of existential crisis that makes people question not just what they know, but whether they've ever actually known anything at all. Professor Quillix was the first to crack. He started making a sound like someone slowly letting the air out of a very expensive balloon, while his tentacles began methodically organizing and reorganizing his academic credentials in what could only be described as compulsive behavior. 17 doctorates, he whispered, staring at his diplomas like they'd personally betrayed him. 17. From 7 different star systems. 4 centuries of accumulated academic achievement. And you're telling me that a human child could have learned everything I know by the time they're legally allowed to operate a motor vehicle? Well, not everything, I said, trying to be helpful. I mean, you probably know a lot of specialized information about your specific fields. It's just that the fundamental thinking skills, the logical frameworks, the problem-solving methodologies, yeah, that's all pretty standard stuff for us. His tentacles started trembling, not just a little shake, but full-on vibration, like he was being electrocuted by the concept of his own intellectual inadequacy. I spent 60 years mastering the theoretical foundations of recursive paradox analysis. 60 years. I wrote 12 books on the subject. I founded an entire academic discipline. And you solved it by drawing pictures that look like something a child would sketch on the back of their homework? To be fair, I said, it was a pretty good sketch. I've got decent handwriting for a human. That's when Vextar started making a noise like a crystal chandelier falling down a flight of stairs. His entire body was flickering between different colors now, which I was pretty sure meant he was having some kind of computational breakdown. The mathematical elegance, he moaned. The quantum theoretical implications, the dimensional framework analyses. I spent 300 years developing new forms of mathematics just to approach problems like this. 300 years. And you're telling me that your species teaches the solutions to their adolescence as recreational activities? Oh, way before adolescence, I corrected, which probably wasn't helping his mental state. We start with basic logic puzzles around age 6 or 7. You know, simple stuff like, if all bloops are florps and all florps are widgets, then what are bloops? By the time kids are teenagers, they're doing this kind of recursive analysis for fun. His crystalline form went completely dark for a moment. When it flickered back to life, he looked like someone had just told him that his entire life's work was equivalent to a human child's finger painting. For fun, he managed to croak out. Well, some of them think it's fun, others find it boring and complain about having to do it. That's actually kind of the point. When something that's supposed to be impossibly difficult becomes routine enough that teenagers get bored with it, you know your educational system is working. Nova 7 had been quietly running diagnostic checks on herself for the past few minutes, and the results were apparently not encouraging. Her vocal processors kept making sounds like electronic sobbing. System analysis indicates critical error in fundamental assumptions about comparative intelligence metrics, she announced in a voice that somehow managed to sound both robotic and deeply depressed. Recalibrating baseline parameters for cognitive assessment. Error. Does not compute. Hey, you don't need to recalibrate anything, I said, trying to be reassuring. You're all obviously very intelligent. It's just that intelligence and education are different things. You guys have been approaching these problems with incredible sophistication. It's just that sometimes sophistication is overkill. But Nova 7 was already deep into what I can only describe as an electronic existential crisis. Downloading human educational curricula for comparative analysis, accessing primary school mathematics programs, accessing middle school logic courses, accessing high school critical thinking requirements. Her optical sensors went wide. If robots could hyperventilate, she would have been doing it. Oh no. Oh no. The computational requirements for standard human 12-year-old educational achievement exceed my graduate-level processing protocols. The logical frameworks taught to human children are more sophisticated than the advanced analytical systems I was programmed with. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice had taken on the tone of someone who'd just realized they'd been playing chess while everyone else was playing three-dimensional holographic chess with time travel rules. Your species doesn't just train children to solve complex problems. You train them to solve problems they've never seen before, under pressure, while maintaining emotional stability and social interactions. You're creating generalized problem-solving systems in biological hardware starting from developmental inception. I mean, when you put it like that, it sounds pretty intense, I admitted. But from our perspective, that's just called school. Professor Zenthek had been quietly having his own breakdown in the corner, making sounds like a filing cabinet being fed through a paper shredder. Finally, he looked up with what I assumed were his optical sensors, though honestly his anatomy was still a mystery to me. "Marcus," he said in a voice that had gone from pompous academic to someone who'd just realized he'd been intellectually outplayed by what he'd assumed was the galactic equivalent of a golden retriever. "When you say that human children learn these skills as standard curriculum, what exactly do you mean by standard?" "I mean mandatory, required by law. Every human child, regardless of their natural aptitude or interest level, has to demonstrate mastery of these thinking skills before they're allowed to graduate and become adults. We literally won't let someone participate fully in society until they can prove they can think their way through complex problems." The color drained out of what I assumed was his face, which was impressive since I hadn't been sure he had color to begin with. "Your species has mandatory intellectual combat training for all offspring." "That's actually a pretty good way to describe it," I said. "We figure that if you're going to be a human in a universe full of problems, you better be really good at solving problems. So, yeah. We put every kid through what amounts to cognitive boot camp." Vextar made a sound like someone had just told him that everything he'd ever learned was wrong, which, to be fair, was basically what had just happened. "And the ones who don't succeed in this training? Get more training until they do succeed. We don't really accept failure as an option. If a kid is struggling, we give them extra help. Different teaching methods, additional resources, whatever it takes. The goal isn't to weed people out, it's to make sure everyone reaches the baseline level of intellectual competency." "What," Professor Quelix asked in a strangled whisper, "is your baseline?" Thought about it for a moment. "Well, by the time they graduate, every human should be able to analyze complex written material for meaning and bias, construct logical arguments and identify flaws in other people's reasoning, solve multi-step problems that require combining information from different sources, and think critically about abstract concepts they've never encountered before." The silence that followed was so profound I was pretty sure I could hear their world views cracking. "And this is considered minimum standard?" Nova 7 finally managed. "This is considered basic literacy," I said. "The stuff you need to function as an adult. The really smart kids, the ones who find this easy, they go on to advanced programs where they study theoretical physics, advanced mathematics, philosophy, and other challenging subjects while they're still teenagers." That's when Professor Kulix made a sound like someone had just explained to him that he'd been playing intellectual t-ball his entire life while thinking he was in the major leagues. "We need to contact our respective governments immediately," he said, his tentacles shaking, "if humanity represents the galactic standard for intellectual development." "Oh no," I said quickly. "We're not the galactic standard. We don't even know what the galactic standard is. We're just us. We developed our educational systems based on what we thought we needed to survive and thrive as a species." Vextar's glow flickered weakly. "Marcus, I need you to understand something. What you've just described, this basic human education, represents cognitive capabilities that exceed the advanced training programs of our most elite intellectual institutions." "Well," I said, because apparently I have no sense of when to stop making things worse. "It's not like we're trying to show off or anything. We just figured that if you're going to give someone a brain, you might as well teach them how to use it properly." The sound that followed was like listening to several entire civilizations simultaneously realizing they might not be as smart as they thought they were. What happened over the next few hours was basically watching the birth of a new galactic order, and I had a front row seat to the whole thing. Not by choice, mind you. I'd been hoping to grab lunch and maybe check out the Academy's recreational facilities, but apparently, solving an impossible problem in 10 minutes makes you a person of interest. The first indication that things had gotten completely out of hand was when Professor Zenthek started making what I can only describe as emergency communications to every major academic institution in known space. I'm talking about priority transmissions, the kind usually reserved for natural disasters or declarations of war. "This is Zephyrin Academy, requesting immediate consultation with the Galactic Educational Council," he announced into his communication device, which looked like someone had crossed a telephone with a small black hole. We have a situation that requires urgent revision of our fundamental assumptions about cognitive development standards across sentient species. Meanwhile, Professor Quillix had gone into what appeared to be full academic panic mode. All 17 of his tentacles were working simultaneously, pulling up holographic displays of curriculum requirements from dozens of different star systems. The guy was basically trying to redesign the entire concept of higher education in real time. If human baseline educational standards exceed our advanced doctoral programs, he was muttering to himself, then our entire system of academic credentialing is fundamentally flawed. We need to establish new benchmarks, new methodologies, new theoretical frameworks for measuring intellectual capability. He paused in his frantic note-taking and looked at me with what I assumed were his eyes, though honestly his anatomy was still pretty confusing. Marcus, would you be willing to serve as an educational consultant? We need to understand how human pedagogical systems achieved such remarkable cognitive development outcomes. Sure, I said, because what else do you say when someone asks you to help redesign galactic education? But I should probably mention that I'm not actually an expert in education or anything. I'm just a regular student. Nova 7's processors made a sound like electronic choking. Defined regular student in human academic parameters. Well, I mean, not gifted or anything. Average grades, decent test scores, nothing special. I'm here on exchange because I needed some easy electives to graduate, and my advisor said alien studies would be a good way to pad my GPA. The silence that followed was the kind of quiet that usually precedes either an explosion or a complete societal collapse. Possibly both. Vextar's crystalline form flickered weakly. You are academically average by human standards. Maybe slightly below average, honestly, I admitted, because apparently I have some kind of psychological compulsion to make things worse. I mean, I got into a decent university, but it's not like I'm Harvard material or anything. My SAT scores were okay, but nothing to write home about. I'm probably going to end up with like a 3.2 GPA, which is fine, but not exactly impressive. Professor Quillix made a sound like someone slowly deflating, while simultaneously having an existential crisis. Several of his tentacles went limp and just sort of dangled there like intellectual surrender flags. Below average, he whispered. The being who just solved our most challenging intellectual problem in minutes, using methods that demonstrate cognitive capabilities exceeding our most advanced analytical systems, considers himself below average by the standards of his species. Well, I wouldn't say I'm stupid or anything, I said, trying to be reassuring. I'm just not particularly brilliant. There are plenty of humans who could have solved this problem faster or more elegantly, or while doing other things at the same time. I've got classmates back home who would probably look at this and ask why you made it so complicated. Nova 7 started making sounds like a computer trying to divide by zero. Accessing Earth educational databases, analyzing human academic achievement distributions, processing comparative intelligence metrics. She went quiet for a moment, then her optical sensors went wide enough that I was worried they might fall out. Oh no. Oh no. Marcus, according to your species' own academic records, you rank in approximately the 50th percentile for intellectual achievement among human university students. Yeah, that sounds about right. Perfectly average, maybe a little below. Why? Because, she said in a voice that had gone completely electronic monotone, that means there are approximately 2 billion humans on your planet who demonstrate cognitive capabilities superior to what you just displayed. 2 billion beings whose problem-solving abilities exceed the combined intellectual resources of our most advanced academic institutions. The implications of that statement hit the room like a small asteroid impact. Professor Zenthic made a sound like a filing cabinet having a heart attack. Professor Quillix's remaining functional tentacles started tying themselves in knots. Vextar's glow dimmed to what could generously be described as a nightlight setting. And that's just the humans currently in higher education. Nova 7 continued, because apparently she had decided to completely shatter everyone's worldview while she was at it. According to Earth demographic data, your species produces approximately 60 million new intellectually trained individuals annually through your basic education system. Wait, I said, starting to realize that maybe I should have been paying more attention to the implications of this conversation. Are you telling me that you guys think humans are unusually smart? Marcus, Professor Zenthic said in a voice that had gone from pompous academic to someone who'd just realized he'd been playing intellectual checkers while everyone else was playing four-dimensional chess. Your species appears to represent a cognitive development paradigm that exceeds our previously understood limits for biological intelligence. That's when my communication device started buzzing. A message from Earth, which was pretty good timing considering I was apparently in the middle of accidentally redefining humanity's place in the galactic intellectual hierarchy. I glanced at the message and couldn't help but laugh, which probably wasn't the best reaction given the current mood in the room. "What is it?" Vextar asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's from my academic advisor back home," I said, still chuckling. "She's checking in to see how my easy semester abroad is going. Wants to know if I'm finding the coursework appropriately relaxed, and whether I'm getting enough opportunities for cultural enrichment without too much academic stress." The silence that followed was so complete I was pretty sure I could hear the heat death of the universe approaching. "Easy semester," Professor Quillix repeated, in a voice that suggested he was questioning every academic decision he'd ever made. "Yeah, this was supposed to be my break semester, you know? Take some light courses, experience alien culture, maybe pick up a few easy credits before I head into my senior year. My advisor was worried that studying abroad might be too challenging, so she made sure I got placed somewhere that wouldn't be too academically demanding." Professor Zenthek made a sound like someone had just explained to him that everything he'd ever believed about the nature of intelligence was fundamentally wrong, which, to be fair, was basically what had just happened. "Marcus," he said slowly, "would you be willing to contact your home institution? We would very much like to discuss the possibility of establishing formal academic exchange programs with human educational systems." "Sure, I can set up a meeting," I said, "though I should probably warn you, they're going to think this is pretty funny. I mean, you guys are supposed to be the advanced alien civilization, and I'm just the average student they sent to make sure I didn't fail my electives." As I started composing a message to send back to Earth, I couldn't help but wonder what my professors were going to think when they found out that their academically unchallenging alien placement had accidentally resulted in humanity being recognized as the galaxy's new intellectual apex species. Honestly, I was just hoping this whole thing didn't affect my GPA.